In a bustling airport, where travelers rush to catch flights and faces blur into anonymity, Walter Harris, an unassuming elderly man, finds himself at the center of an unexpected confrontation. With his well-worn leather satchel containing medals of honor, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, Walter quietly prepares to board his flight. But when a skeptical TSA officer stops him, questioning his past and accusing him of lies, Walter's dignity and decades of sacrifice are suddenly brought into doubt. What begins as a routine security screening turns into a moment that will ripple far beyond that checkpoint. As assumptions are made and tensions rise, Walter faces a conflict far greater than misplaced suspicion. But through it all, his patience and quiet strength inspire unexpected allies, challenge long-held prejudices, and spark a movement that no one, least of all Walter, saw coming. The hum of suitcase wheels on polished floors echoed through the busy airport as Walter Harris walked with unhurried steps. At 68 years old, Walter moved with the straight-backed dignity of someone who had seen more of the world than he cared to discuss. He was an ordinary figure in a crowd of rushed travelers dressed in neatly pressed button-down shirt and slacks. His shoes, though scuffed from years of wear, were polished to a quiet shine, reflecting the discipline of his past. Walter's only companion was a worn leather satchel slung over his shoulder. It had seen better days, its edges frayed, and its surface soft from years of handling. Inside the bag rested items more valuable to him than anything money could buy. There were medals carefully wrapped in a velvet cloth, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom awarded to him the day before. Walter never thought he would stand on such a stage, hearing his name spoken by the president, receiving applause from dignitaries who would forget his face as soon as they left the room. Yet, here he was one day, a celebrated hero, the next just another traveler blending into anonymity. He preferred it that way. Walter joined the security line with practiced calm, his quiet demeanor making him almost invisible. Around him, voices rose with impatience as people juggled bags, jackets, and shoes. He listened absent-mindedly to the woman in front of him scolding her toddler, the man behind him muttering about flight delays. This chaos no longer fazed him. Years of war had trained him to filter noise, to find focus amid the din. When it was his turn, Walter handed his ID and boarding pass to the agent, a young woman whose tired eyes barely glanced at him before motioning him forward. He offered her a polite nod, though she did not see it. Walter was used to being overlooked. He stepped toward the conveyor belt, slowly removing his belt, watch, and small collection of items from his pockets. His movements were deliberate. Patience was second nature to him. Placing the leather satchel onto the belt, he waited as it moved into the scanner. The TSA officer watching the screen furrowed his brow, staring longer than usual. The belt stopped abruptly. "Whose bag is this?" a sharp voice rang out. Walter looked up, raising his hand. "It is mine." The officer's name tag read Ryan Bradley. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with a sharp jawline and an edge to his tone that Walter recognized authority, not yet tempered by wisdom. Bradley picked up the leather satchel, his eyes narrowing as he weighed it in his hands. "Step over here, sir," he said curtly, motioning toward a small table near the checkpoint. Walter complied without complaint, his movements calm. The world had taught him long ago that it was better to comply than to protest. At the table, Officer Bradley unzipped the bag, his expression growing more suspicious as he pulled out the velvet-wrapped box. He peeled back the fabric, revealing the gleaming medals inside. The largest medal, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, rested at the center, its polished surface catching the harsh overhead lights. "What are these?" Bradley asked, holding up the medal as if it were counterfeit. Walter met his eyes without flinching. "They are my medals," he replied evenly. "I received that one yesterday from the president." The young officer scoffed, a skeptical smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yesterday? From the president? He shook his head as if the very idea were absurd. What kind of service gets someone like you this medal? Walter paused, his jaw tightening slightly. The words "someone like you" stung in a way he thought he had grown immune to. The weight of his years, the sacrifices, the missions, the silence pressed against him like a heavy stone. But Walter had long mastered the art of control. "Military service," Walter said simply. 40 years. Bradley's smile vanished, replaced by a thin mask of disbelief. Around them, a few curious travelers watched the scene unfold, their gazes flicking between the officer and the older man. Walter felt their eyes on him, the way they lingered on his worn clothes, his calm face, and the medals now strewn across the table. "These look too fancy for someone flying coach," Bradley muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Walter to hear. Walter said nothing, his patience holding steady. He could see in Bradley's eyes that the man had already made up his mind. No explanation would change his suspicion. "Step into the side room," Bradley ordered abruptly, gesturing toward a small door marked "Security Screening." Walter picked up his bag, leaving the scattered whispers of the travelers behind him as he entered the room. It was small and sterile, with white walls and a single metal table in the center. Walter took a seat as instructed, his hands resting on his knees. He waited. Minutes later, Bradley entered the room, followed by another TSA officer, a man in his 50s with graying hair and weary eyes. His name tag read Robert Harper. Harper looked at the medals on the table, his expression softening with recognition. "What is going on here?" Harper asked, his tone less sharp, more hesitant. Bradley held up the Presidential Medal of Freedom with an accusatory glare. "Claims he got this from the president yesterday. Says it is his." Harper's brows furrowed as he turned to Walter. "Is that true, sir?" Walter nodded calmly. "It is." Harper hesitated, clearly recognizing the medal's significance. "Bradley," he began quietly, "maybe we should—" "We are not taking his word for it," Bradley snapped, cutting him off. "I will handle this." Walter watched the exchange without comment. He had seen this dynamic before, one man pushing forward with stubborn authority, another unsure whether to intervene. It was the same dance he had witnessed on countless battlefields, just with different uniforms. As Bradley continued his interrogation, Walter's thoughts wandered to the ceremony from the day before. He could still feel the president's firm handshake, hear the applause, and see the respectful nods of the men and women who had gathered to honor his sacrifices. That moment had felt unreal, as though it belonged to someone else. And now, here he sat, stripped of that honor in a sterile room, his life's work reduced to suspicion and doubt. Suddenly, the crackle of the airport loudspeaker broke the silence. "Attention passengers, General Richard Thompson has just arrived at Gate 12. Walter allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Thompson. It had been years since Walter last saw his former commander, a man who had always led with strength and integrity. Their bond had been forged under fire, the kind of connection that distance could not erase. The announcement hung in the air like a promise. Outside this room, someone who knew the truth was just steps away. Someone who had seen Walter's sacrifices firsthand. Bradley's questions faded into background noise as Walter held on to that thought. Reinforcements had arrived. The door to the small, sterile room opened, breaking the tension like a sudden gust of wind. Officer Harper turned his head first, his expression one of relief, as a suited young man stepped inside. The newcomer looked slightly out of place, his crisply pressed suit and urgent demeanor contrasting sharply with the room's cold, functional surroundings. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but firm. "General Richard Thompson has requested to speak with Mr. Harris immediately." Walter sat unmoving, his hands still resting calmly on his knees. His face betrayed nothing, but inside he felt a quiet flicker of satisfaction. Reinforcements had arrived, just as he had hoped. Officer Bradley's head snapped up, his brow furrowed in irritation. "General Thompson?" he repeated, his tone defensive. "We are in the middle of a security screening. Tell him to wait." The young man hesitated, glancing nervously at Bradley before shaking his head. "With respect, sir, General Thompson does not wait." Bradley's face flushed. He stood taller, trying to maintain control of the room, but the balance of power was shifting. Harper cleared his throat awkwardly, stepping aside as though making space for the inevitable. Bradley shot him a sharp look, then turned back to Walter, gripping the Presidential Medal of Freedom as though it gave him authority. "We are not done here," Bradley snapped. "Sit tight." The young messenger exited quickly, and moments later the doors swung open again, this time with a force that commanded attention. General Richard Thompson strode into the room, filling the space with his presence. Though older now, his frame remained strong and unyielding, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture straight as ever, his uniform a crisp, dark suit decorated with symbols of a life spent in service, was immaculate. Thompson's eyes swept the room, landing on Walter. His face softened, the faintest trace of a smile breaking through his otherwise stern expression. "Walter," he said warmly, extending a hand. "It is good to see you." Walter rose slowly, clasping Thompson's hand in a firm, steady grip. "General," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying a weight of respect. "It has been a long time." Thompson turned sharply to Bradley, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as they took in the scene, the scattered medals, the open bag, and the look of defiance on the younger officer's face. "What exactly is going on here?" Thompson asked, his voice measured but commanding. Bradley squared his shoulders, clearly trying to hold on to his confidence. "Sir," he began, his tone clipped, "we are conducting a routine screening. This man claims these medals are his, but—" Thompson held up a hand, cutting Bradley off mid-sentence. "Claims?" he echoed, his voice icy. He stepped closer to the table, picking up the Presidential Medal of Freedom with care. His fingers brushed the surface, his expression hardening as though the very suggestion of doubt was an insult. Turning to face Bradley fully, Thompson asked, "Do you know what this is, son?" Bradley faltered. It looks like—" "It is the Presidential Medal of Freedom," Thompson interrupted, his voice rising slightly, the weight of his authority filling the room. "It is the highest civilian honor awarded in this country, and this man, Walter Harris, earned it." Bradley's face flushed deeper, but he tried to argue. "I was just following protocol, sir." "Protocol?" Thompson shot back, his voice sharp. "Do not hide behind protocol when what you are really doing is letting prejudice cloud your judgment." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Officer Harper's head dropped slightly, guilt pooling in his posture as he avoided Walter's gaze. Bradley, on the other hand, looked flustered and defensive. "I did not mean—" Thompson stepped closer, his presence looming over the younger officer. "You meant exactly what you said," Thompson growled. "But I will not stand by while a man of Walter Harris's stature is treated like a criminal." He gestured toward the medals scattered across the table. "Each of these tells a story of sacrifice, of bravery, and of a commitment to this country that few could match." Walter remained silent, watching the scene unfold with measured calm. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was say nothing at all. Thompson turned back to Walter, his voice softening. "I am sorry you had to endure this nonsense," he said quietly. "You deserve better." Walter nodded, his voice even. "Thank you, General. I have faced worse." Thompson gave a faint smile, admiration flashing in his eyes. "I know you have." Bradley, now visibly shaken, looked at Harper as though searching for support. But Harper simply stared at the floor. Thompson stepped back, motioning toward the door. "You are free to go, Walter. Come on, let us get you out of here." Walter picked up his satchel, carefully replacing each medal into the velvet-lined box. He moved with the same deliberate calm he always carried, as though to show that no indignity, no moment of doubt could truly shake him. As he followed Thompson out of the room, Bradley remained frozen, his authority crumbling into silence. Harper finally looked up, his eyes meeting Walter's for the briefest of moments. In that glance, Walter saw something regret, perhaps, or recognition of the mistake that had been made. The door closed behind them, and the noise of the airport greeted Walter like an old friend. Travelers hurried by, announcements crackled overhead, and the hum of life resumed. But for Walter, the world felt quieter somehow, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold. General Thompson led him to a quieter part of the terminal, away from the curious eyes of passengers. "Are you all right?" Thompson asked, studying Walter closely. Walter nodded. "I have been through worse." Thompson sighed, his expression hard. It should not have happened. Men like Bradley, people who cannot see beyond their own narrow views, they need to learn. Walter looked away, his gaze settling on a young mother kneeling to tie her child's shoe. Her hands moved gently, her smile patient. "It is not the first time," Walter said softly, "and it will not be the last." Thompson's expression darkened. "That does not make it right." Walter met his eyes, his voice steady. "No, it does not, but anger will not fix it either." Thompson studied him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "You are a better man than most." Walter offered a faint smile. "I am just a man who learned when to pick his battles." As they sat quietly, a nearby flight attendant approached. She was young, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, addressing Walter. "I wanted to thank you for your service. We have upgraded your seat to first class." Walter blinked, surprised. "You did not have to do that." "It is the least we can do," she replied. "Thank you for everything." Walter nodded, his heart unexpectedly moved. "Thank you, miss." As she walked away, Thompson grinned. "See, sometimes kindness comes when you least expect it." Walter glanced at his old friend and smiled. For all the doubt and prejudice he had faced, there were still people who could see him not as an inconvenience or a relic of the past, but as a man worthy of respect. And that, he thought quietly, was enough. Walter Harris stood at the gate, holding his satchel close to his side. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, gate changes announced over crackling speakers, passengers scrambling for their boarding passes, and families gathering in huddled clusters. But amidst the noise, Walter felt a strange sense of stillness. General Thompson had left him at the gate with a final reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Keep your head up, Walter," he had said, his voice steady. "People like Bradley might doubt you, but you have earned every bit of respect this country can offer." Walter had offered only a quiet nod in return. Thompson's words carried weight, but Walter did not need them to stand tall. He had learned long ago that dignity was something a man carried within himself, no matter what the world chose to believe. The boarding call for his flight rang out. Walter stepped forward with measured grace, offering a polite nod to the attendant scanning his ticket. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said warmly. "Thank you," Walter replied, her small kindness settling in him like a balm against the events of the day. When he entered the plane, Walter felt a fleeting sense of unease. Flying had never come naturally to him. In his years of service, he had traveled in all manners of aircraft, but there had always been a purpose to it. Sitting as a passenger in a crowded commercial plane felt different, strange, and disconnected from the man he had been. He found his seat in first class, thanks to the flight attendant's thoughtful upgrade. Walter did not allow himself to indulge in luxury often, but today he accepted it for what it was, an unexpected gesture of respect. The seat beside him remained empty for a while as the other passengers filed in. Then came a flurry of movement, backpacks rustling, sneakers squeaking, and a young voice announced itself with surprising energy. "Hi!" Walter looked up to find a boy of about 12 standing in the aisle, his wide eyes full of curiosity. His shaggy brown hair fell over his forehead, and a baseball cap hung awkwardly from his hand. "You must be sitting here," Walter said gently, moving his satchel to give the boy room. "Thanks," the boy said, plopping into the seat beside him. He settled quickly, placing his cap on his lap and grinning as though the world were made entirely of opportunities. Walter offered him a polite smile, expecting the boy to turn his attention to the in-flight entertainment. Instead, the boy turned to him, his gaze falling on the satchel that Walter clutched protectively against his leg. "What's in the bag?" the boy asked with the openness only children possess. Walter raised an eyebrow, momentarily caught off guard. "Personal items," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. The boy seemed undeterred. "My name is Caleb Myers," he said. "What's yours?" "Walter Harris." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Harris." Caleb stuck out his hand, and Walter, amused by the boy's enthusiasm, shook it firmly. They sat quietly for a moment, but Caleb's curiosity got the better of him. He gestured toward the satchel again. "Is it medals? It looks like medals. My grandpa has one. He was in the Navy. He keeps it in a big wooden box, but I am not allowed to touch it." Walter's grip on the bag loosened slightly. "Your grandfather served?" "Yeah. He tells me stories sometimes, mostly about the places he visited, not the fighting part. He says those are stories for soldiers, not kids." Caleb paused, then looked back at Walter with an innocent earnestness. "Are you a soldier too?" Walter hesitated, the boy's simple question stirring something deep within him. "I was," he said finally. Caleb's eyes widened. "Whoa, what kind of soldier?" Walter allowed a small smile to tug at the corner of his mouth. "An old one." The boy laughed, a clear and genuine sound that lifted something heavy from Walter's chest. "Old but cool, I bet," Caleb replied, leaning back into his seat. Walter looked out the small window as the plane taxied to the runway. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to relax. Caleb's easy curiosity and unfiltered kindness felt like a breath of fresh air. The boy had no doubt, no suspicion, just honest admiration and interest. As the flight took off, Caleb continued to chatter, filling the space between them with questions about airplanes, travel, and his own life. He talked about his family, a mother who worked too much, a father who was away often, and a grandfather who spent most of his time in the garden. Walter listened quietly, offering small responses where needed, content to let the boy's voice fill the silence. Eventually, Caleb circled back to the satchel. "You must be really brave," he said suddenly, his voice softer now. "If you got medals, I mean." Walter turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in the boy's tone. "It is not about bravery," he replied after a moment. "It is about doing what you have to do for the people beside you." Caleb tilted his head thoughtfully. "Like your friends?" "Yes." "Exactly." Caleb nodded, his young mind trying to process the weight of Walter's words. "That is what my grandpa says too. He says soldiers never fight for medals. They fight for each other." Walter's chest tightened. "Your grandfather is right." The boy looked up at him, studying his face carefully, as though trying to see the soldier beneath the quiet exterior. "Do you miss it?" he asked finally. Walter turned back to the window, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I carry it with me wherever I go." The words surprised him, even as he said them. It was true. Though his service, his sacrifices, and the men he had served alongside were etched into his very being. He carried them in the medals, yes, but also in his memories and the lessons they had taught him. Caleb fell silent for a while, leaning his head against the seat. When he spoke again, his voice was soft and careful. "I think you are a hero, Mr. Harris." Walter's breath caught in his chest. He looked at Caleb, the boy's eyes bright with sincerity, and felt a warmth he had not expected. "Thank you, Caleb," he said quietly. The rest of the flight passed in peaceful silence, Caleb eventually dozed off, his head tilted to the side as he slept. Walter watched the clouds roll by outside the window, his thoughts lingering on the boy's words. Hero. He had never thought of himself as one. Heroes were men whose names were carved into stone, whose stories were told in history books. Walter had always seen himself as a man who simply did his job. But Caleb's simple belief, his unshakable certainty stayed with him. A gentle reminder that respect and kindness sometimes came from the most unexpected places. As the plane began its descent, Walter leaned back in his seat, feeling lighter somehow. The events of the morning, Bradley's suspicion, the sterile room, the shame he had fought so hard to suppress, no longer weighed so heavily on him. Because kindness, he realized, had a way of balancing the scales. Walter Harris stepped off the plane with Caleb's innocent words still lingering in his mind. "I think you are a hero, Mr. Harris." Those words had planted themselves somewhere deep within him, their weight light but steady, like a stone in a pocket. The airport seemed quieter now, the earlier tension gone. The suspicion he had faced from Officer Bradley no longer sat so heavily on his shoulders. Instead, Caleb's kindness, the boy's belief in him without question, had softened the edges of a bitter memory. Walter made his way to the baggage claim, his leather satchel slung securely over his shoulder. He moved deliberately through the crowd, the noise of chatter and rolling suitcases fading into the background as his thoughts turned toward home. Home. It was not much, but it was a small single-story house on a quiet street, lined with sycamores. Walter had lived there for nearly 20 years. The white paint had started to peel in places, and the screen door creaked every time it opened. But Walter liked it that way. It felt honest. He had no use for flash or luxury. After collecting his modest suitcase, Walter stepped outside to hail a cab. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the city, the warmth a welcome contrast to the sterile chill of the airport. A cab pulled up, and Walter slid into the back seat, settling his satchel onto his lap. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Walter gave his address, and the cab pulled into traffic. The ride was quiet except for the hum of the radio playing softly in the background. Walter looked out the window, watching the city pass by, families walking hand in hand, teenagers racing each other on bikes, an older man sweeping his front porch. He wondered, not for the first time, how many people around him carried stories that no one would ever know. When the cab finally pulled up in front of his house, Walter paid the driver, thanking him politely before stepping onto the cracked concrete of his driveway. He stood for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of his home. The small porch was lined with potted plants, mostly flowers tended by his granddaughter, Emily. Walter could see a flicker of movement through the front window, and his lips curved into the faintest smile. Emily was waiting for him. As he opened the creaky screen door, he heard her call out from the kitchen, "Grandpa, is that you?" "It is me," Walter replied, his voice warm but steady. Emily, 16 and sharp-eyed, appeared in the hallway, her dark curls bouncing as she ran toward him. "You are back," she said with a grin, throwing her arms around him. Walter returned the hug gently, mindful of the satchel still slung over his shoulder. "You act like I have been gone for months," he said, his voice teasing. "You were in Washington, Grandpa," Emily said, pulling back to look at him. "That is a big deal." Walter shrugged slightly. "It was just a ceremony." "Not just any ceremony," Emily countered, her eyes shining with pride. "The President, Grandpa. You have a Medal of Freedom. That is incredible." Walter said nothing, his throat tightening slightly. He had never been one to seek praise or attention, and his granddaughter's excitement, though genuine, made him feel strangely unsteady. "Come on," Emily said, tugging his arm. "I made tea, and dinner is almost ready." Walter followed her into the kitchen, the warmth of home wrapping around him like an old quilt. The scent of roast chicken filled the air, mingling with the faint floral smell of the tea brewing on the stove. Emily always made the house feel alive in ways Walter could not. Since she had come to live with him 5 years ago, after her mother, his only daughter, passed away, Emily had been the quiet anchor in his life. As Walter set his satchel down carefully by the table, Emily glanced at it. Her curiosity piqued. "Are the medals in there?" she asked softly. Walter nodded. "Yes." "Can I see them?" she asked hesitantly, as though she might be overstepping. Walter hesitated for a moment. He had always kept his medals private, not out of shame, but because they carried a weight he could not put into words. But Emily, his Emily, had earned the right to see them. "Sit down," he said gently. Emily obeyed, sliding into a chair as Walter carefully unzipped the satchel. He pulled out the velvet-lined box and placed it on the table. For a moment, he simply looked at it, his hands resting lightly on the worn edges. "These are not just medals," Walter said quietly as he opened the box. Inside, the medals glinted softly in the kitchen light. The Presidential Medal of Freedom at the center, surrounded by service ribbons and stars earned over decades. Each one is a story, a memory. Emily leaned forward, her gaze wide with awe. "They are beautiful," she whispered. Walter picked up the Presidential Medal of Freedom, holding it between his fingers. "This one, I received it yesterday. It represents more than me. It represents the men I served with, the sacrifices we made together. I would not have this without them." Emily's brow furrowed slightly. What was it like, being there, getting this? Walter thought back to the moment, the president's handshake, the applause, the weight of it all. It felt strange, he admitted, like I was there for them, not for myself. And yet, in the airport today, he trailed off, his expression clouding. Emily tilted her head. What happened? Walter hesitated. He had not planned to tell her about Officer Bradley, about the suspicion and the small humiliation that still clung to him. But as he looked at her, her eyes so earnest, so trusting, he decided she deserved the truth. "Someone doubted me," he said simply. "They looked at these medals and saw a lie." Emily's face fell, her hands balling into fists. "What? But that is so wrong. How could they?" Walter placed the medal back in its case and closed the box gently. "It happens," he said softly. "Sometimes people only see what they expect to see, but it is not their doubt that matters." Emily sat back, her expression thoughtful. "Did you say anything to them?" Walter shook his head. "I did not need to. Someone else spoke for me." "Who?" "An old friend." Emily's face brightened slightly. "Good. You deserve someone in your corner." She paused, then added, "You deserve respect, Grandpa. If they cannot see that, it is their loss." Walter's chest tightened. For all his years of service, for all the praise he had received from people he would never meet again, nothing meant more to him than hearing those words from his granddaughter. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly. She smiled at him, reaching out to rest her hand on his. "You do not have to carry it alone, you know. The memories, the stories. You can share them with me." Walter looked at her, the kindness in her eyes undoing something deep within him. For so long, he had held his past close, guarding it like a precious secret. But maybe, he thought, sharing it could be a kind of release, a way to honor those who had fought beside him and to make sense of the man he had become. The creak of the screen door startled them both. Walter looked up to see a figure standing awkwardly on the porch. His brow furrowed as he recognized the man, Officer Harper. "Who is that?" Emily asked, glancing toward the door. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly as he stood. "Someone I did not expect to see." Walter paused just inside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the figure standing awkwardly outside. The porch creaked under Officer Robert Harper's weight as he shifted his feet, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked uncomfortable, almost as though he had wandered there by accident. Can I help you? Walter asked, his voice steady and measured. Harper glanced up, his expression uncertain. Mr. Harris, I... He cleared his throat as if forcing the words out. I hope I am not disturbing you. Walter studied him for a moment. It is late. What brings you all the way here? Emily had come up behind her grandfather, her curiosity obvious as she peered past him to look at Harper. Grandpa, who is this? Someone from earlier, Walter said simply, keeping his tone neutral. He turned back to Harper. You might as well come in before the mosquitoes get you. Harper looked visibly surprised by the invitation, but nodded gratefully. Thank you, sir. Walter stepped aside, letting him into the small living room. Harper's gaze flickered over the modest furnishings, family photos on the walls, Emily's school books stacked neatly on the coffee table, and the faint glow of the kitchen lights spilling into the room. The house was warm and lived in, a sharp contrast to the sterile walls of the airport screening room where they had last spoken. Emily stood near the doorway, eyeing Harper warily. Grandpa, do you want me to stay? Walter gave her a small nod of reassurance. It is all right, Emily. Why don't you go finish setting the table? After a reluctant glance at Harper, Emily disappeared into the kitchen, leaving the two men alone. Walter gestured toward the old armchair in the corner. Sit if you want. Harper lowered himself into the chair, his movements stiff, as though he feared he might break something. Walter took his usual spot on the couch, his back straight, hands resting lightly on his knees. He waited, saying nothing, forcing Harper to speak first. The younger man let out a slow breath, clearly uneasy. Mr. Harris, he started again, his voice lower now. I came to apologize. Walter raised an eyebrow, his expression calm, but unreadable. For what, exactly? Harper flinched slightly, but he did not look away. For earlier, at the airport. He shifted, searching for words. I stood there and let Bradley treat you the way he did. I could have spoken up. I should have spoken up, but I didn't. The silence that followed felt heavy, broken only by the faint sounds of dishes clinking in the kitchen. Walter's gaze never wavered. And why didn't you? Harper exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as though trying to scrub away his guilt. I do not know, he admitted. I guess I was worried about stepping on toes, about making a scene. He hesitated before adding, but that is not an excuse. Walter studied him, weighing the sincerity in his words. For a man like Harper, a man who seemed so used to fading into the background, admitting fault was no small thing. I have spent the rest of the day thinking about it, Harper continued, thinking about what you must have felt. And I realized it is not just about today. It is about how often people like me stand by and let things like that happen. It is easy to do nothing. Too easy. Walter leaned back slightly, his hands folding in his lap. What do you want from me, Officer Harper? Harper looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't want anything, sir. I just... He pulled something out of his coat pocket, holding it out to Walter. It was a small envelope, plain and unassuming. I wrote this earlier. It is just something I wanted you to have. Walter took the envelope carefully, his brow furrowing. He opened it, pulling out a single sheet of paper covered in Harper's careful handwriting. The words were simple but heartfelt. Mr. Harris, I let you down today, and I cannot change that. But I want you to know that I am sorry, not just for what I did not do, but for what it says about me. You deserved better. You deserve respect, not silence. I am going to do better from now on, not just for you, but for every person who comes after you. With regret, Robert Harper Walter read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it on the table. He looked at Harper again, his face still calm, though something in his expression had softened. You did not have to come here, Walter said quietly. I know, Harper replied, his voice steady now, but I needed to. Walter nodded, letting the words settle in. There was no undoing what had happened at the airport, but this Harper showing up, uncomfortable and ashamed, was a start. For men like Walter, who had spent a lifetime learning to forgive even the worst offenses, it was enough to see someone take responsibility. "I appreciate your honesty," Walter said finally. Harper let out a slow breath, relief evident in his posture. "Thank you for hearing me out, sir." Walter leaned back, his gaze turning thoughtful. "It is not easy to admit when you are wrong," he said. "It is even harder to do something about it." Harper nodded, understanding the unspoken challenge. "I want to do something about it," he said quietly. "I have already started looking into local veteran programs. I want to volunteer help the men and women who served, like you did." Walter tilted his head slightly, studying him. The words sounded genuine, not performative. There was a determination in Harper's voice that told Walter this was not just guilt speaking. "Then do it," Walter said simply. "Do not just say it. Do it." Harper nodded again, his expression resolute. "I will." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the kitchen in the background. The faint smell of roast chicken filled the room, grounding Walter in the familiar comforts of home. "Do you have a family, Officer Harper?" Walter asked suddenly. Harper looked surprised at the question. "A wife, 2 kids boys, one just turned 10. Walter nodded. "Then do it for them, too. Show them how a man does right by others." Harper's face softened, and he stood slowly, reaching out a hand. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, for everything." Walter shook his hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, Harper." Harper nodded and turned toward the door. As he stepped back onto the porch, Emily appeared in the doorway, holding a dish towel in her hands. She watched Harper leave, her curious gaze following him, until the screen door creaked shut. "What did he want, Grandpa?" Walter looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "To apologize," he said simply. Emily frowned. "For the airport?" Walter nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, and sometimes that is enough." She tilted her head, studying him as though searching for something. "Did you forgive him?" Walter smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I did, because he came here to say what needed to be said, and because forgiveness is how we move forward." Emily considered his words, then nodded, satisfied. "Dinner is ready," she said, retreating into the kitchen. Walter lingered for a moment, looking at the letter Harper had left on the table. It was not grand, nor was it life-changing, but it meant something. Unexpected kindness, even from someone who had failed you, could light a path forward. As he sat at the dinner table that evening, the sound of Emily chattering about her day filling the room, Walter felt the smallest weight lift from his shoulders. There was still a long way to go, there always would be, but tonight, kindness had taken a step toward healing what doubt had tried to break. And that, Walter thought quietly, was a victory. The morning sun poured through the lace curtains of Walter Harris's small kitchen, lighting the table where he sat, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. The house was quiet, except for the distant chirp of birds outside. Emily had already left for school, leaving Walter alone with his thoughts. Walter turned the small envelope from last night's visit over in his hand. Officer Harper's letter sat neatly folded inside, its weight far heavier than the paper it was written on. There was something about the younger man's sincerity, his admission of failure, and his decision to act that had lingered with Walter. It reminded him of something his old commander, General Thompson, used to say during the long stretches between missions. "The right path rarely feels comfortable, but that's why it matters most." The doorbell rang suddenly, pulling Walter from his thoughts. He rose slowly, his back stiff, and moved toward the front door. Through the screen, he saw a sleek black sedan parked in his driveway, and standing on his porch was Eleanor Vaughn, the airport director. She looked different here, out of the tense airport atmosphere, less stern, more thoughtful. A leather-bound portfolio was tucked under her arm, and her eyes were cautious but warm as Walter opened the door. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice even. "I hope I am not intruding." Walter gave her a measured look, resting his hand on the doorframe. "Director Vaughn, to what do I owe the visit?" "I was hoping to speak with you," Vaughn replied, offering a faint smile. "May I come in?" Walter considered her for a long moment. He was not a man to turn someone away without hearing them out, no matter who they were. Finally, he nodded, stepping aside. "Come on in." Inside, Eleanor settled onto the couch, smoothing out her navy skirt as Walter took his usual spot in the armchair across from her. The room felt small and personal, its walls lined with photos of family and quiet memories. Vaughn's eyes lingered for a moment on a black-and-white picture of a young Walter in uniform. "Nice place," she said politely, though her tone carried more reverence than small talk. "Thank you," Walter replied simply. He gestured to the coffee pot in the kitchen. "Would you like some?" "No, thank you," Vaughn said, shaking her head. She shifted the portfolio in her lap and looked at Walter with a kind of quiet resolve. "Mr. Harris, I came here today because of what happened at the airport." Walter's face remained neutral, though his chest tightened slightly. "You already apologized for that." "I know," Vaughn said quickly, "and I meant it. But an apology is not enough, not for someone like you." Walter said nothing, his silence inviting her to continue. Vaughn opened the portfolio, pulling out several documents. "After that incident, I started thinking about how we, as an organization, handle situations like yours. The truth is, we don't handle them well, not yet." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What happened to you wasn't just about one officer's poor judgment. It's about a bigger problem, a lack of understanding, of respect for the men and women who have served this country." Walter studied her, his sharp gaze taking her in. She spoke with conviction, but he had heard promises before. "So what do you plan to do about it?" he asked. Vaughn held out a sheet of paper, placing it carefully on the table between them. "I'm creating something called the Carter Initiative. It's a program designed to train our airport staff, not just TSA officers, but everyone on how to engage with veterans, recognize their experiences, and treat them with the respect they deserve." Walter raised an eyebrow, the name catching him off guard. "The Carter Initiative?" "Yes," Vaughn said firmly. "It's named after you." Walter leaned back slightly in his chair, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I didn't ask for my name on anything." "I know you didn't," Vaughn said, undeterred. "But what happened to you struck a chord with everyone who heard about it. And not just because it was unfair, but because of how you handled it with patience and dignity. That's what inspired this program." Walter looked down at the papers, the official-looking print outlining program details, mandatory training, veteran support, and plans to hire more veterans for roles at the airport. Vaughn continued as he read. "I'm not here to ask for your permission to start the initiative," she said softly, "but I am here to ask for your help. I want you to consult with us to share your experiences and your insights. Help us make this program mean something." Walter's first instinct was to refuse. For decades he had kept to himself, carrying his service quietly, away from the world's attention. He had never asked for recognition or praise. He had simply done his job, as so many others had. But Vaughn's words stirred something in him. The image of Officer Bradley flashed briefly through his mind, not as an antagonist, but as a symptom of something larger. He thought, too, of Officer Harper's visit, his humility, and his desire to do better. And then he thought of Caleb, the boy on the plane, who had looked at him with awe and respect without needing proof. The world, Walter realized, was full of people trying to understand, and others who simply needed to be shown the way. "This program," Walter said slowly, choosing his words with care, "it's not just for show, is it?" "No," Vaughn replied, her voice firm. It's about real change. Walter sat quietly for a moment, staring at the documents before him. He thought of the men he had served with, the ones who never came home. Their sacrifices deserved more than silence. If he could help honor them, even in some small way, then perhaps this was a path worth taking. All right, Walter said finally, his voice steady. I'll help. Vaughn's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she had been holding her breath. Thank you, Mr. Harris. You won't regret it. Walter nodded, though his expression remained guarded. I'll hold you to that. As Vaughn gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Walter walked her to the door. She paused on the porch, turning back to him. I meant what I said, you know, she said softly. You inspired this. People are listening because of you. Walter looked out toward the sycamore trees lining the street, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. If they're listening, he replied, then let's make it worth their while. Vaughn smiled, a genuine smile that softened her usually serious expression. We will. As the black sedan pulled out of the driveway, Walter remained on the porch, watching it disappear down the street. The air was cool against his skin, carrying with it the faint sounds of a world waking up. He felt the familiar weight of his past, the memories, the losses, the battles fought long ago. But for the first time in a long while, that weight felt purposeful. Behind him, the creaky screen door opened, and Emily stepped outside. Who was that, Grandpa? Someone trying to fix things, Walter said simply. Emily tilted her head, watching him curiously. Are you going to help her? Walter looked down at his granddaughter, her eyes so full of trust and hope. I am, he said softly. Emily smiled brightly. Good. You'll be great, Grandpa. Walter chuckled under his breath, reaching out to rest a hand on her shoulder. We'll see about that. As they stood together on the porch, the sun rising steadily over the trees, Walter felt a quiet shift within himself. For so many years he had carried his past alone, never asking for recognition or change. But maybe, just maybe, helping others see the truth would mean that the sacrifices of men like him and the ones who never came home would not be forgotten. And that, Walter thought, was worth every step forward. Walter Harris adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror, the reflection staring back at him looking both familiar and foreign. He had not worn a tie this often since retiring, and he wondered if it still suited him. The navy blue fabric contrasted against his crisp white shirt, but Walter's steady gaze and the lines of his face told the real story. A man who had carried years of silence with quiet strength. The past few weeks had been busier than Walter ever expected. Eleanor Vaughn's Carter initiative had begun to take shape, and true to her word, it was not a showpiece, but a serious effort for change. She had involved veterans organizations, hired consultants, and built sessions for cultural sensitivity, especially focusing on how to respectfully interact with servicemen and women. But Vaughn had also pushed Walter to the forefront. You do not need to be anything but yourself, she had told him during their first meeting. People just need to hear you. Walter had been skeptical. He was not a speaker. He had spent most of his life blending in and staying quiet. He was a soldier, not a storyteller. Yet something about Vaughn's persistence, about her genuine belief in what this initiative could become, nudged him into action. And so, here he was. Walter picked up his worn leather satchel from the table, slipping the strap over his shoulder, and stepped outside into the soft morning light. Emily had already left for school, leaving the house unusually quiet. He paused for a moment on the porch, letting the calm of the morning settle around him. Then, with a steadying breath, he walked toward the waiting car Vaughn had sent for him. The airport conference room was larger than Walter had imagined. Rows of chairs were set up in neat lines, and sunlight poured in through tall windows overlooking the runway. Eleanor Vaughn greeted him at the entrance, her expression a mixture of warmth and reassurance. Ready? She asked, her voice low but encouraging. Walter nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. Good? You will do just fine, Vaughn replied. Just speak from the heart. He followed her into the room, where a crowd of airport staff, TSA agents, gate attendants, and administrators was already gathered. Some leaned back in their chairs, others stood near the walls, arms crossed. They had been told about the initiative, but Walter could sense their skepticism in the air. It was the same skepticism he had seen many times before, people unsure whether change was necessary or possible. Vaughn stepped to the podium first, her voice carrying authority as she introduced Walter. Today we have the honor of hearing from Mr. Walter Harris, Vaughn began. Walter is not only a decorated veteran, but a man who carries his service and his humility with quiet strength. He is here not to lecture us, but to share his story and to remind us of the dignity every person deserves, no matter their uniform, title, or seat on a plane. The room quieted, a ripple of curiosity spreading as Vaughn stepped aside and gestured to Walter. Walter approached the podium slowly, setting his satchel down on the table beside him. His fingers brushed the strap as he gathered his thoughts, steadying himself. I'm not much for speeches, he began, his voice clear but quiet. But I was told you just need to hear the truth. So that's what I'll give you. The room remained still, all eyes on him. My name is Walter Harris, he continued. I served this country for 40 years in the Army. I fought battles overseas, watched good men fall, and carried home memories that will stay with me for the rest of my days. Walter paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. But I didn't come here to talk about war. I came here to talk about respect, about dignity. He reached into his satchel and carefully pulled out the velvet-lined box. He opened it slowly, revealing the medals inside. The Presidential Medal of Freedom gleamed at the center, its polished surface catching the sunlight. Walter held it up briefly for the room to see. This medal was given to me by the President of the United States, he said, his voice steady. Not because I asked for it, and not because I sought recognition. It was given to honor the men and women I served alongside the ones who never came home. It represents them, not me. He set the medal back into the box with care, letting the silence that followed settle over the room. A few weeks ago, Walter continued, I went through this very airport. I carried this medal in my bag, and I was stopped at security. I was questioned, accused of lying, and made to feel as though my years of service had no meaning. And I'm not the first man to go through that. I will not be the last. Several heads lowered slightly, a few glancing at one another. Walter could see their discomfort, but he did not shy away. It would have been easy to get angry, to fight back, he said, but anger rarely solves anything. I chose instead to stand my ground, not for myself, but for every veteran, every person who deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Walter looked up, meeting the eyes of several TSA agents near the front of the room. Some of you wear uniforms too. You know what it means. A uniform is not just clothing, it's a story, a promise. When you see someone who served, who sacrificed, you owe them a moment of understanding. He let the words linger before continuing, his voice softening. But this isn't just about veterans. It's about how we treat everyone. Whether it's a soldier carrying a medal or a grandmother struggling with her bags, respect is something we all deserve, and it's something we can all give. The room was silent now, the skepticism replaced with something quieter, thoughtfulness, perhaps, or reflection. Walter saw it in their faces. Some looked down, others met his gaze with understanding. Walter stepped back from the podium, resting his hands lightly on the satchel. Thank you for listening, he said simply. If you take nothing else from my words today, let it be this. Treat people with kindness. It costs you nothing, but it could mean everything to someone else. He turned and walked back toward Vaughn, his footsteps slow and steady. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Then, almost as though on cue, someone began to clap. The applause started softly, hesitant at first, but quickly grew louder. Soon, the entire room was on their feet, the sound echoing off the walls. Walter nodded faintly, accepting their appreciation without fanfare. Vaughn met him with a proud smile as he returned to her side. "I told you they just needed to hear you," she said quietly. Walter gave her a small nod, his expression thoughtful. "We'll see if they were really listening." As he walked toward the back of the room, a young TSA officer stepped forward, a man Walter recognized from earlier in the crowd. "Mr. Harris," the young man said nervously, holding out his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. I never thought about it like that before." Walter shook his hand firmly, a small, knowing smile on his face. "It's a start, son." Outside the conference room, the sun hung high in the sky, bright and steady. Walter walked toward the car, waiting to take him home, his steps lighter than they had been in years. For the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe his story mattered not just to him, but to others who needed to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, change was possible after all. Walter Harris stood at the edge of the makeshift stage, his posture straight, hands tucked behind his back as the final applause from the conference room echoed in his memory. Now back at home, he watched the quiet street from his porch, the hum of an airplane overhead faintly breaking the stillness. It had been a week since he spoke to the airport staff, and Eleanor Vaughn had been quick to share the results. "They heard you, Walter," she had told him over the phone 2 days later. "I've never seen such an immediate shift. People are talking, they're asking questions, and most importantly, they're thinking." Walter had nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He was pleased to hear it, though he wouldn't admit that to Vaughn. A lifetime of humility kept him grounded. "You're making a difference," she had said, before hanging up. Now he sat in his usual spot on the porch, Emily's flowers swaying gently in the soft spring breeze. She had planted pansies this year, bright purple and yellow, that reminded Walter of medals pinned against dark uniforms. It was fitting somehow. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke his thoughts. Walter looked up to see a familiar car, Eleanor Vaughn's sleek sedan, pulling into the driveway. She stepped out, a thick folder tucked under her arm, her purposeful stride softened by the warmth of her smile. "Back again already?" Walter asked as she climbed the steps. "You don't get rid of me that easily," she teased, settling into the chair beside him. She placed the folder on the small table between them, her expression turning serious. "What's all this?" Walter asked, eyeing the folder warily. "Updates," Vaughn said simply, opening it and sliding a few papers toward him. "You asked if people were really listening. I thought you'd want to see for yourself." Walter picked up the first sheet. It was a summary of changes taking place within the airport, new training sessions scheduled, protocols updated, and programs to recruit veterans for leadership positions. He scanned the words with quiet interest, the corners of his mouth tugging into the faintest of smiles. "People are taking it seriously," Vaughn said, watching him closely. "We're already seeing real improvements." Walter nodded, though his voice remained calm. "That's good to hear." She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "But that's not all. Your story has traveled farther than you think." Walter glanced at her, one brow raised in quiet skepticism. Vaughn reached into the folder again, pulling out a small stack of letters. "These came to the airport. People heard about what happened to you, your patience, your dignity, and they wanted to say something." Walter hesitated before taking the first letter. He unfolded it carefully, his rough hands smoothing the paper as his eyes scanned the handwriting. "Dear Mr. Harris, I read about what happened to you in the news. My grandfather was a veteran too, and I regret not appreciating his stories when he was alive. Your words helped me understand the sacrifices he made. Thank you." The next letter was just as heartfelt. "Mr. Harris, I'm a TSA officer in a different city. I saw what you said about respect, and it made me think about how I treat the people I screen every day. I won't forget it. Walter read letter after letter, each one stirring something deep within him. These were strangers, people he had never met, but their words were filled with gratitude, understanding, and change. The ripples had begun to spread, reaching people far beyond that conference room. He set the last letter down, the weight of it settling in his chest. "I didn't expect this," he admitted softly. Vaughn smiled, her voice kind. "Sometimes the smallest truths resonate the loudest." Walter looked away, his gaze drifting over the street as he considered her words. All he had done was share a story, his story. And yet, it had mattered. "I need to ask you for one more thing, Walter," Vaughn said carefully. Walter turned back to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What now?" Vaughn took a deep breath. "I want to expand the Carter Initiative beyond this airport. I've been talking to other directors across the country, and they're interested in implementing similar programs." She paused. "But they need to hear from you, Walter. They need to hear the story that started it all." Walter frowned, leaning back in his chair. "I already spoke once. Isn't that enough?" "I know it's not what you're comfortable with," Vaughn replied gently. "But your words carry weight, more weight than you realize." Walter said nothing for a long moment, his thoughts churning. He had never asked for this spotlight, never wanted it. And yet, he thought of Harper standing on his porch, of Caleb on the plane, of the letters now sitting on his table. It wasn't about him. It was about what his story could do, what it could mean to others. He let out a slow breath, nodding faintly. "All right, I'll do it." Vaughn's smile returned, relief softening her features. "Thank you, Walter." The next few weeks passed in a blur. Vaughn had arranged a series of speaking engagements at other airports, and Walter found himself stepping onto new stages, standing in front of fresh faces, TSA officers, airline staff, managers, all of them watching him with curiosity and, more often now, respect. At first, Walter felt the same hesitation he had when he spoke that first day. What could he say that mattered? What could his words really change? But with each session, his voice grew stronger. He told them about the airport incident not with anger, but with honesty. He spoke about the men he had served alongside, the sacrifices they had made, and the quiet dignity they had carried. And he reminded them, as he had before, that respect cost nothing but could mean everything. One day, after finishing a session at a busy Chicago airport, Walter was approached by a young TSA agent. The man looked barely older than Emily, his uniform crisp, his expression earnest. "Mr. Harris," the agent said, holding out a hand, "I just wanted to say thank you. My father served in Iraq, but I never really understood what it meant until I heard you speak." Walter shook his hand firmly, his voice steady. "You're welcome, son. Take care of yourself." As the agent walked away, Vaughn came up beside Walter, a satisfied look on her face. "You're changing minds, Walter." Walter watched the young man disappear into the crowd. "I hope so," he said quietly. That evening, Walter returned home to the familiar creak of his front porch. Emily was there waiting for him, her legs tucked under her as she sat on the swing. "How'd it go today?" she asked, looking up with a bright smile. Walter settled into the chair beside her, setting his satchel down. "It went well," she grinned. "People are listening, huh?" Walter nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Seems like they are." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft rustling of the sycamores filling the air. Finally, Emily spoke. "You know, Grandpa, you're doing something important. You're helping people see what matters." Walter looked at her, her young face so full of conviction. He thought of Caleb, of Harper, of the letters now tucked carefully into a drawer inside the house. And he realized Emily was right. "It's not about me, Emily," he said softly. "It's about all of us." She nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe, but someone had to start it." Walter leaned back in his chair, looking up at the deepening sky. The ripples of change had begun to spread, and he could feel it not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of understanding. And for the first time in a long while, Walter Harris let himself feel something close to pride. The morning sunlight was soft, filtering through the leaves of the sycamore trees that lined Walter Harris's quiet street. A light breeze carried the smell of spring, earthy and new, as Walter sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled between his hands. This was his routine. It was a simple ritual, one that allowed him a moment of calm before the day truly began. But this morning felt different. The soft hum of a mail truck interrupted the stillness. Walter glanced toward the curb as the mail carrier, a young woman with a cheerful wave, slipped a few envelopes into his mailbox before pulling away. Walter stood, his knees creaking in protest as he made his way down the steps to the mailbox. He sorted through the envelopes as he walked back toward the house bills, a charity flyer, a bank statement. Then his fingers froze when they touched something unexpected, a plain white envelope. No return addresses. Walter's brows knitted together as he turned it over in his hands. The handwriting on the front was neat and deliberate, addressed simply to Mr. Walter Harris. It looked familiar, though he could not quite place it. He returned to his seat on the porch, set the other mail aside, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Walter unfolded it and began to read. "Mr. Harris, I don't know if you'll want to hear from me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. My name is Ryan Bradley. You might remember me as the officer who stopped you at the airport." Walter paused, his breath catching briefly. Bradley, the young officer who had held up his medals as if they were counterfeit, whose doubt had set the entire chain of events into motion. Walter's hands tensed slightly around the letter, but he forced himself to keep reading. "I've thought about what happened that day every single day since. At first I tried to justify it. I told myself I was following protocol, just doing my job. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I saw you an older man, quiet, carrying medals, and I doubted you. Not because of anything you did, but because of something broken in me." Walter's expression softened as he continued. "After everything happened with General Thompson and the airport director, I lost my job. I was angry at first. Angry at you, at them, at the system. But the truth is, losing my job forced me to take a hard look at myself. And I didn't like what I saw. I realized that I had let prejudice guide my actions. I had judged you unfairly, and I had forgotten the very things my own father tried to teach me." Walter's brow furrowed slightly, his thoughts lingering on that last line. "My father served in the Marines. He was a quiet man, like you. He never talked much about his time in the military, but I knew he carried it with him every day. He taught me to respect people like you, to see their sacrifices, even if they didn't talk about them. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I let the job, the rules, and my own flaws cloud what should have been clear." Walter's fingers relaxed their hold on the letter, and he leaned back into his chair. The words felt heavy, but they rang true. "I wanted to write to you to say I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I haven't earned it, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to make things right. I've started volunteering with a local veterans group. I help men and women transitioning back into civilian life find jobs and housing. It's not much, but it feels like a start. I'm grateful for what you said at the airport and in those sessions. Your words stuck with me, even when I didn't want to hear them. They reminded me of my father and of the kind of man I want to be. So thank you, Mr. Harris. Thank you for your patience and for your dignity. I didn't deserve it, but you showed it anyway." Sincerely, Ryan Bradley. Walter set the letter down on the small table beside him, his gaze distant as he let the words settle. For a long moment, he said nothing, the quiet of the morning filling the space around him. He thought back to that day at the airport, the look of skepticism on Bradley's face, the tension of the room, the coldness of his words. At the time, Walter had carried no anger toward him. Frustration? Yes. Hurt, certainly. But anger? No. It had been clear to Walter then that Bradley's actions were less about malice and more about ignorance. And now here the young man was, admitting fault, owning his mistakes, and trying to do better. Walter reached for his coffee and took a slow sip, his eyes drifting to the horizon. Forgiveness was not always easy, but it was necessary. It was something he had learned long ago on long, dusty marches in foreign lands, in letters home to grieving families, in moments where men had no choice but to lean on one another. His thoughts were interrupted by the familiar creak of the screen door. Emily stepped onto the porch, a book tucked under her arm. She paused when she saw the expression on Walter's face. "Everything okay, Grandpa?" Walter looked up at her, the corners of his mouth softening into a faint smile. "Yes, Emily, everything's fine." She crossed the porch and settled into the swing, tucking her legs beneath her as she always did. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the letter. Walter glanced down at it before folding it carefully and slipping it back into the envelope. "It's from someone who made a mistake," he said simply, "and someone trying to make it right." Emily tilted her head, her curiosity plain. "Did you forgive them?" Walter looked at her for a long moment, considering her question. "I think I did," he replied softly. "Sometimes forgiveness isn't just for the person who's asking. It's for yourself, too." Emily nodded thoughtfully, as if storing those words away for later. "So, are they different now? The person who wrote it?" Walter leaned back in his chair, staring out at the street again. "It sounds like they're trying to be. And sometimes, that's enough." Emily smiled faintly, satisfied with his answer. "I like that." Walter let out a quiet hum of agreement, the wind rustling the leaves overhead. In his lap, the envelope rested lightly, its weight no longer a burden. Bradley's letter was not redemption that would take time and action, but it was a start. It was proof that people could change, that small ripples of kindness could reach farther than anyone imagined. Walter had not asked for this role, but it was clear to him now that his story, his patience, his words mattered in ways he had never expected. As the sun climbed higher, Walter let his mind drift back to Bradley's words, to the young man's efforts to make things right. Walter had spent a lifetime learning that change was slow, that progress was earned one small step at a time. And here, before him, was a step in the right direction. "Grandpa," Emily said suddenly, her voice light, "you know what I think?" Walter turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I think you're changing the world," she said with a grin. "One person at a time." Walter chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm just an old man with a story, Emily. That's all." "Maybe," she replied, "but it's a pretty important story." Walter looked out at the horizon, the sky stretching wide and clear. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe stories, especially the ones told with quiet truth, were enough to light the way forward. And as he sat there on his porch, the letter resting beside him, Walter Harris felt a quiet sense of peace. It was not about the past anymore. It was about what came next. The morning air was crisp as Walter Harris stepped onto the neatly paved sidewalk outside a sprawling convention center in Washington, D.C. The building loomed large before him, its towering glass facade reflecting the pale gold of the rising sun. He stood still for a moment, taking in the sight. Though he had been invited as a guest of honor, Walter could not shake the feeling that he did not belong in places like this, grand halls filled with important people saying important things. But Eleanor Vaughn had been insistent. "Walter, this is not just for you," she had said when she handed him the formal invitation. "It's for everyone you represent, every veteran, every person who has faced the doubt you endured. Your story needs to be shared." Walter had reluctantly agreed. And now here he was, standing outside the National Veterans Legacy Summit, a prestigious annual event that gathered leaders, veterans, and advocates from across the country, Vaughn's Carter Initiative had caught the attention of national organizations, and Walter's role in its creation had turned him into an unexpected figurehead. Walter adjusted the collar of his jacket and glanced at the small crowd gathering near the entrance, men and women in tailored suits, older veterans in uniforms adorned with ribbons, young advocates clutching folders and notebooks. He moved toward the doors, his steps slow but steady, the worn leather satchel still hanging over his shoulder. Inside, the convention center buzzed with energy. Booths and banners lined the hallways, representing organizations offering services for veterans' job placement programs, mental health initiatives, housing assistance. Walter passed by them with quiet interest, nodding politely when someone smiled his way. A uniformed volunteer greeted him near the entrance to the main hall. "Mr. Harris?" Walter paused, straightening slightly. "That's me." "Right this way, sir," the volunteer said, her voice warm and respectful. She led him through the bustling crowd and into a quiet, carpeted hallway that opened up into the event's main ballroom. The space was vast, chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, rows of round tables already filled with attendees. Walter hesitated at the entrance, the sheer size of the room giving him pause. "You made it," the voice came from his left, calm and familiar. Walter turned to see Eleanor Vaughn striding toward him, dressed in a sleek navy suit, her posture as confident as ever. She offered him a smile as she approached. "Barely," Walter replied dryly. Vaughn chuckled, clearly unbothered by his gruffness. "You'll do just fine. Come on, they're eager to hear from you." Walter gave her a skeptical look. "Eager, you say?" "Trust me," Vaughn said, guiding him toward a table near the stage. "They know who you are, Walter, and they know what you've done. People are listening." Walter settled into a seat at the reserved table, his hands folding on the smooth white tablecloth as conversations hummed around him. The guests included leaders of major veterans organizations, decorated military officials, and even government representatives. Despite their importance, Walter kept to himself, offering polite nods but saying little. Before long, Vaughn stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The microphone crackled to life as she addressed the crowd. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you for joining us for the National Veterans Legacy Summit. Today, we honor not only the sacrifices of those who served, but also the responsibility we all share to ensure they are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The crowd listened intently as she spoke, her words measured but powerful. Vaughn's gaze swept the room as she continued. Change begins with a single act. One moment where someone chooses to stand up and speak when it would be easier to stay silent. Today, I want to introduce you to someone whose quiet strength has sparked change not just for himself, but for veterans and civilians across this country, Mr. Walter Harris. The applause started softly, but quickly grew louder, spreading across the room like a wave. Walter remained seated for a beat longer than necessary, his heart hammering in his chest. Finally, he rose from his chair, his movements slow but deliberate. With his satchel at his side, he made his way to the stage. The crowd fell silent as he stepped up to the podium, the spotlight illuminating the deep lines of his face and the steady calm of his gaze. Walter gripped the edges of the podium, taking a moment to look out over the crowd before he spoke. "I am not a speaker," he said, his voice even and low. "And I'm not someone who ever looked for attention. I was just a man doing my job." He paused, the silence in the room thick and expectant. "Not long ago, I stood in an airport security room, questioned about who I was and what I had done. It wasn't the first time I had been doubted, and it won't be the last. But what I learned that day, what I've learned my whole life, is that respect is not something you demand. It is something you give. It is something you earn." Walter opened his satchel, pulling out the velvet-lined box containing his medals. He placed it gently on the podium, opening it so that the medals caught the light. These medals represent service, yes, but they also represent sacrifice, mine, and the men I served alongside. Men who gave everything they had so others could live freely. His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on familiar faces: Eleanor Vaughan, General Richard Thompson, and others who had supported him along the way. What happened to me at that airport wasn't about one man or one mistake. It was about something deeper, a failure to see, to listen, and to understand. And the truth is, it happens every day, not just to veterans, but to people all over this country. People whose stories we ignore because we're too quick to judge, too quick to doubt. Walter's voice softened, his tone steady but firm. If we want to honor the sacrifices of those who served, then we have to do more than offer words. We have to choose respect, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. That's how change happens, one moment, one act, one choice at a time. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Walter looked down at the medals once more, then closed the box carefully and returned it to his satchel. "Thank you," he said simply, stepping back from the podium. The crowd erupted into applause, rising to their feet as Walter made his way back to his seat. He felt the weight of their gratitude, but more than that, he felt something quieter, a sense of peace. Eleanor Vaughan met him at the bottom of the stage steps, her expression bright with pride. "You did it," she said softly. Walter shook his head with a small smile. "No, we did it." That evening, as Walter sat on his porch with Emily beside him, he handed her a small stack of letters, more messages of thanks, sent from people who had heard his story. She thumbed through them, her smile growing with each one. "Grandpa," she said suddenly, looking up at him, "do you think they'll keep listening?" Walter leaned back in his chair, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "I think they will," he said quietly, "and if they don't, we'll just keep telling the story." Emily grinned, setting the letters aside and resting her head on his shoulder. The night settled around them, quiet and still, and for the first time in years, Walter felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. The ripples had begun, and even though the world was far from perfect, Walter knew that change, real change, always started small. One act of kindness, one moment of understanding, one voice willing to speak the truth. And for Walter Harris, that was enough. As Walter Harris's story reminds us, change begins with small acts of respect, kindness, and understanding. It is not the grand gestures, but the simple, deliberate choices we make each day that inspire real progress. By listening, by caring, and by standing up for what is right, we can create ripples that reach far beyond what we see. If this story touched your heart, inspired reflection, or left you with hope, please consider subscribing to our channel. Here, we share stories of resilience, dignity, and the power of human connection, stories that remind us that every voice matters and every action counts. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment to let us know how this story resonated with you. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful content that inspires change and spreads hope. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, respect costs nothing, but it can mean everything to someone else. Subscribe now, and let's keep making a difference one story at a time.